Hello again. My name is Dr. Jacob Gran, and in this video we will look at a somewhat uncommon topic, which is 3-to-1 counterpoint, or counterpoint in triple meter. Most counterpoint textbooks just consider this either a special case of 2-to-1 counterpoint with an extra beat, or 4-to-1 counterpoint with a missing beat, so it rarely gets its own chapter. But I think 3-to-1 counterpoint exercises are the perfect opportunity to introduce one of the fundamental forms of voice-leading dissonance. And so, we will make sure to look at it in some detail. As usual, the video will be broken into 3 parts. First, we will learn some of what makes 3-to-1 exercises unique by looking at an exercise by Beethoven and his teacher Albrechtsberger. Then we will introduce the second of the 3 fundamental voice-leading dissonances, the dissonant neighbor tone. Then, as usual, I will leave you with tasks you can do on your own to increase your mastery over this kind of exercise. In 3-to-1 counterpoint, we use a triple meter, usually 3/4 in our counterpoint melody against each dotted half note in the Cantus Firmi, which creates a time signature of 3/4, although occasionally 3/2 will also be used. Beat 1 is still the downbeat, like in every other exercise, and beats 2 and 3 are both metrically weak. And as we've seen in the previous video, the weak beats are where the dissonances are going to go. Here is Albrechtsberger's D minor Cantus Firmi that I showed at the end of the last video. This is one of the Cantus Firmi that he used when teaching Beethoven in the mid-1790s. Unlike many other historical counterpoint instructors, Albrechtsberger did not skip over teaching 3-to-1 exercises, and he seems to even have placed an emphasis on them. Here's Beethoven's completed counterpoint melody. And here's the same melody written as an analytic diagram. Here we can see that Beethoven is treating the strong and weak beats exactly the same as in a 2-to-1 exercise, but with one extra beat in each measure. All of the downbeats have consonant intervals, and he places dissonant passing tones only on the weak beats 2 and 3. Notice also Beethoven's interesting voice crossing, where the counterpoint melody dips below the Cantus Firmi. I wouldn't suggest doing this very often, but here it creates a really nice effect. The overall shape of Beethoven's counterpoint has 2 high points on F, and the voice crossing happens during the given melody's high point, and the 2 lines end up nicely balancing one another. Another unique thing about Beethoven's 3-to-1 exercise are these unconnected notes on the second beat of these 2 measures. Beethoven approaches them by a leap of a fourth, and then immediately leaps back to the tone that he came from. Everything we've learned so far about melodic fluency has taught us that leaps should be recovered in the opposite direction, or filled in, and that the leap should affect the shape of the melody somehow, but these don't do that. This type of figure is called an embellishing tone. Embellishing tones are almost always downward leaps of a third or a fourth that complete the missing chord member of a triad. Now, we haven't gone over chords or triads just yet, so if you really want to understand what's going on here, you'll have to circle back to this concept once we've covered chords and triads in future videos. For now, just know that you are allowed to use embellishing tones on the second beats of your 3-to-1 exercises, if they form the interval pattern of a 6th, 3rd, 6th, like Beethoven's here, or 5th, 3rd, 5th. Beethoven's teacher, Albrechtsberger, corrected him in 2 places. Let's listen to Albrechtsberger's version, and then rewrite it as an analytic diagram so that we can compare. It's important to say at the beginning that Beethoven didn't make any real voice-leading mistakes. At this point, Beethoven had already studied counterpoint with Haydn years earlier, so he was sort of a black belt level student. Instead, Albrechtsberger seems to be offering some high-level suggestions for improvement. The first change happens here. In the third measure, he changes Beethoven's C natural to a C sharp leading tone. He probably wanted to do this in order to strongly confirm the key of D minor. Again, we haven't studied harmony yet, but Beethoven's embellishing tone figuration in this measure suggests a tonicization of the key of F major. And that is almost certainly why Albrechtsberger wanted to make this change. Again, not a voice-leading error, just an improvement. Unfortunately, we can't have G as an embellishing tone anymore, since it would create a leap of an augmented fourth from the C sharp. So the changes in this little section are there to accommodate the new leading tone and its resolution to D on the next downbeat. The other change comes over here, where Albrechtsberger replaces Beethoven's 5-6-5 pattern with a 5-3-5 embellishing tone. Albrechtsberger's change has to do with the exercise's harmonic rhythm. Harmonic rhythm is the rate of change of the implied chords or harmonies. Beethoven's notes D and E, together with the G of the given melody, cannot all be members of the same triad, and so his 5-6-5 pattern, which is also known as a consonant neighbor tone, implies a change of chord on all three beats of the measure. Compare that to Albrechtsberger's embellishing tone, which has a much slower harmonic rhythm, because it arpeggiates through a single G minor triad for the entire measure. Like I said earlier, if you don't understand this just yet, come back to this video after we go over chords and triads. A consonant neighbor note would not cause any problems in a different meter, but in triple meter, each measure is broken into an odd number of beats, and so an uneven or herky-jerky harmonic rhythm can disrupt the steady flow of the melody. Albrechtsberger therefore prefers Beethoven to keep a regular harmonic rhythm of about one implied chord per measure, sometimes two. Notice that the earlier alteration also conveniently got rid of Beethoven's other consonant neighbor. Overall, we can say that Albrechtsberger's corrections are not aimed at criticizing Beethoven's counterpoint melody, since his exercise has no flaws in the voice leading. Instead, he hoped to get Beethoven to pay more attention to the harmonic implications of his melody, which is an advanced lesson. In our 2-to-1 exercises, we learned about the dissonant passing tone, which was the first of the three fundamental voice-leading dissonances in Western music. In 3-to-1, we can introduce the second type, which is the dissonant neighbor tone. Like the passing tone, the neighbor tone is approached by step, but is left by step in the opposite direction, rather than continuing in the same direction the way that the passing tone had done. Here, I'm showing a dissonant seventh, F, acting as an upper neighbor to the note E. Notice that by leaving the dissonance in the opposite direction, neighbor notes will always end up returning to the note from which they came. When we show our dissonant neighbor notes in an analytic diagram, I want you to notate it in the following way. Just like the dissonant passing tone, the dissonant neighbor note will be shown with a filled-in note head, but with no stem. Instead of a solid slur, we will use a dashed slur to connect the repeated consonant tones on either side of the neighbor note. Here we are using the dashed slur to indicate the same kind of tone repetition that we used it for back in our 1-to-1 exercises in the first video. Whereas the passing tone had been used to show how a dissonance may fill in a leap of a third between two consonances, here we're using our notation to show that a dissonance may also be used to prolong a single consonant interval. In fact, you can think of the dissonant neighbor as an elaboration of a more basic underlying consonance. In this case, the neighboring seventh decorates an underlying consonance of a sixth between G and E. Although the melody seems active because it is made out of faster note values, the melody didn't really progress to a new sound, and so dissonant neighbors have a way of slowing down the apparent speed of our exercises, so we shouldn't overuse them or put too many of them in a row. When choosing between whether you want to use an upper neighbor or a lower neighbor, be sure to take into consideration the shape of your melody as it approaches the next downbeat. Typically, it is best to try to accentuate contrary motion, so an upper neighbor works best for a descending motion, and vice versa. Older theorists, like Fuchs, did not include the dissonant neighbor as a fundamental kind of voice-leading dissonance, and so he didn't include a chapter on 3-1 at all, since he believed there wasn't anything new to learn there. Later theorists pretty much all came to believe that the neighbor note is an important thing to teach, and began to include it in their 3-1 exercises. Here's an example of 3-1 counterpoint written below a given melody that uses dissonant neighbors by the theorist and composer Hermann Roth. Roth uses a dissonant neighbor tone on the second beat of the third measure, and here it works exactly like the examples that I just showed. This later dissonant neighbor is a little bit different though. It occurs on the third beat of the measure, and the return to F occurs on the next downbeat, rather than within the same measure. This raises an important question. Should a dissonant neighbor tone fall on the final beat of a measure? Let's zoom in on these two measures. When we rewrite the passage as an analytic diagram, we can see that the two Fs form a tone repetition that straddles between the two measures. So the counterpoint F forms a relationship with both the F and D of the given melody. There isn't anything strictly speaking incorrect about this, and it is a voice-leading situation that does occur in real music. But we should recognize that having a dissonant neighbor on the final beat of a measure is a conflation of two different concepts. It is both a dissonant neighbor as well as a consonant suspension, which we will learn about in a future video. Since, for now, all we are interested in is learning about the dissonant neighbor, and suspensions belong to a different kind of counterpoint exercise, let's go ahead and say that we will not have dissonant neighbors on beat 3 of our 3-1 exercises. In fact, if we were to allow dissonant neighbors on the final beat, then we really should have included it back in our 2-1 exercises. Here again, we would have a conflation of the neighbor note and a consonant suspension, but the underlying consonant relationship of a tenth between C and the return to E would be even more hidden than in the previous example. The whole point of teaching species counterpoint is to show voice-leading concepts in their simplest forms, and then to gradually progress to the more advanced forms. So, in my opinion, the dissonant neighbor should be taught only in a 3-1 context on the second beat, and not on the final beat of a measure, at least not until we get to freer forms of counterpoint later on. So, here is a summary of the rules of our 3-1 exercises. In addition to the normal rules for melodic fluency, you may compose consonances on any of the 3 beats of a measure. Dissonant passing tones can occur on either of the weak beats, 2 or 3. And dissonant neighbor tones can occur only on beat 2. You may also use embellishing tones that form a 5-3-5 interval pattern within a measure, or 6-3-6 pattern. For our cadences, you should either use a consonant neighbor note pattern, 6th, 5th, 6th, or 3rd, 5th, 6th, in the second to last measure. When composing below a given melody, our counterpoint will either cadence with a 5th, 4th, 3rd cadential formula, which uses a dissonant passing tone, or a 3rd, 4th, 3rd pattern, which uses a dissonant lower neighbor. Here are two new Cantus Firmi by Felix Salzer to use when composing your 3-to-1 exercises. The first is in A major, and the second is in G minor. But again, feel free to transpose if you have a solution that requires you to adjust the ranges of the melodies. Like usual, I'd prefer it if you composed away from an instrument and tested your ability to audiate the exercises, especially paying attention to the harmonic dissonances that arise during passing tones and neighbor notes. Making your analytic diagrams should be pretty easy. First, label the harmonic intervals and give all of the dissonant tones filled-in note heads with no stem. Then, cover the passing tones with solid slurs, and the neighbor tones with dashed slurs. Now that our exercises are getting a little bit more complex, I hope that you will start to see the usefulness in making these analytic diagrams. Notice that if you remove the dissonances from our diagram, we will be left with a diagram that has only 1-to-1 and 2-to-1 consonant relationships in it. This is called a rhythmic reduction, and it is useful in showing the skeleton of our melodies. As our melodies become more complex, these kinds of diagrams and reductions will only become more and more helpful. That's all for this video. Stay tuned for the next one, where we will discuss composing in a 4-to-1 rhythmic proportion.